doing 4 melachot. One of them is quite extensive, the other one are shorter. And there are quite a few applications in today's time. So I filled it up in Hebrew because there's no room for the English. Various details. The first one has to do with removing the hide, the skin, from sheep. As you know, after the animal was slaughtered, the hide needed to be removed and later processed in order to prepare it for whatever application that we're going to use the hide of the animal. Whether to ride on, whether to use it for something else, it first needed to be removed. That's called mafshit. In English it's called to skin an animal. To skin an animal is a surah on Shabbat, it's one of the melachot, one of the avot malachah. And some of you may be surprised, but this also would apply not just to the skin of a regular animal, like a cow or a goat, but it would also apply to the skin of a bird or a fish, if it's in its raw state. Because those skins are useful. They can be used, for some applications. They're not as thick as a regular hide, but they're still considered ore. They still are in the category of skin, and it would be prohibited to remove them on Shabbat in their raw state. Obviously, birds like chicken and fish, once they're cooked, then the whole thing becomes food. It doesn't become something separate on its own. So if you have something that's uncooked, you don't want to remove the skin. Yeah, I was going to say that it would be muktzah anyway, unless it's a fish which you could eat raw too. But the chicken, yes, you can't eat the raw chicken if you don't want to just move it around. Yeah, it can be, yeah. But that's not the main concern here so much. The bigger concern is that when it's in its raw state, perhaps in az melachah midorata, something that's prohibited by the Torah, as opposed to something which is in the Rabbanan. So if it's in its raw state, one can have removed the skin. This melachah of mafshit also applies to if you have skin already removed and you want to slice it out to several pieces. So prim will do that. People who process hides in preparation of the klaf, making a klaf. The skin, the hide of an animal is pretty thick, and you could make something out of the bottom half, out of the upper half. One is called klaf, one is called gofsusus. One is closer to the flesh. One is where the hair grows. One is better for certain things. Right? There's a different consistency, I guess, to that. Regardless, the idea here is removing the skin, or even removing parts of the skin of the hide, would be called mafshit, and it would be an az melachah on Shabbat. There's not too many other applications for this on Shabbat, because it applies basically to skins, not to anything else. The other melachot may apply to other things as well. So this is a short melachah. Just have to be aware that it applies to any skin. No. Just a skin that can be used for something that's shimushi, something that's useful. Yeah, now we spoke about the nails. The pruning of the nails is a different problem. That you have to be careful with. But it would not fall under that. The next melachah is called me'abed. Me'abed is once the skin, the hide was removed, it needed it to be processed. In processing hide, there are several stages. It's very interesting how they process. You see, if they don't process the hide and they just remove it from the animal, they leave it alone, after a while it will rot. So it has to be preserved, and it has to be processed, it has to be prepared in order to make it useful. Whether you're going to make leather shoes, right, or whether you're going to write a Sefer Torah on it, it has to be processed. That's called me'abed. Me'abed is called processing, and in more common English you will find the word tanning. Tanning. Vursekai is the tanner, the individual who processes it, correct. And in the tanning process, you actually have several stages. You have the curing of it, where they put the hide into some chemicals, salts, to preserve it. The curing basically gives it some preservation. And this happens in stages, and at a certain stage, they put stronger chemicals. And at the end, of course, they stretch it, they remove the hair, they scrape it, they do all sorts of things in preparation for its use. This happens over several weeks, probably. And all of these steps are asura and fall under the category, or under the melachah of me'abed, of tanning. Right. So we have several applications here that one needs to be careful with on Shabbat, that would fit into me'abed, either midoraita or midrabanan, by rabbinical decree. The first example that I wrote is oiling any leather goods. You know how there's some applications that to oil, to smear leather goods, whether it's leather shoes, whether it's gloves, or whether even if it's upholstery, using a certain type of oil, smear it on Shabbat, it's a form of ibud, of processing it. Because what are we doing? We are softening it. That's what the oil does. Certain oils do to the leather. So if that's what it accomplishes, is in softening the leather, it would be a to do that on Shabbat, because that's called me'abed. It's a form of continuous processing that can continuously be done to it. However, before we go on, let's remember that midoraita, at least, there's no ibud ve'ochli. There's no processing of foods. The reason for that is because food is consumed once, and that's it. these items that are made out of skin, what are we doing with it? We are processing it. We want it to remain permanently. We want to use it. So food is very different, right? You eat it. That's it. It's gone. So mideoraita, according to Torah, ibud, processing, canning, preserving, curing, does not apply to food. However, this is where it's important to pay attention. Midirabanan, by rabbinical decree, there is certain types of ibud in food. You cannot make preserves on Shabbat. Preserve is a form of preserving, right? Of curing the food to last for a while. Putting it also in similar chemicals and brine and salts to preserve this food. So midrabanan, certain types of food, not all food, would be asur to preserve. However, there's a difference. The main distinction in the preservation of food is depending how many you're doing. Let's say you have pickles, a cucumber, right? And you only want to put salt on one piece and eat it right away. That's okay. That will be mutar. But if you have a whole bunch of cucumbers, or pickles actually, because that's the way it's done when it's put into pickle, not into pickle. When you have a whole bunch of them together, midrabanan is prohibited. So on Shabbat, you cannot take a whole plate of pickles and pour salt all over it. Even though your intention here may be just to give a taste. Right. Because it appears, only because of the appearance, that you are preserving it. Because that's the way preservation is done. So if you need to put salt, and I use pickle for a reason, you're going to see why, because it does not apply to all vegetables. An important condition here is that this is regularly done to preserve that vegetable. Right? So one way to do it is you do it as you eat it. That's fine. So the point over here is that there are certain vegetables that are preserved, and midrabanan is asur because it resembles the real thing. But if you're doing it one at a time, it's okay. Now, what's asur is only with salt. Let's say you want to put paprika, pepper, onion powder, garlic powder. That is not a spice for preserving foods. It's perfectly fine. No problem. It's okay. Go ahead. Only salt. Salt preserves. So salt becomes an issue on Shabbat and on Yom Tov sometimes too. Another point to keep in mind is that even though the Rabbanan said it's asur to preserve foods, that's only foods that are usually preserved. Tomatoes are usually not preserved, perhaps except only the cherry tomato. A lot of people love to cut tomatoes and to put salt over them. That's okay, even a lot of them. Why? Because that's not a vegetable that's preserved. You follow me? So if a vegetable is not ordinarily preserved, there's no problem here with the Rabbanan. Rabbanan only prohibited preserving or putting salt, which is a form of preservation, on those yerakot, sheregilim, that one is used to preserving them. Another exception would be if the vegetables are already cooked, right? Something is already cooked, you're not preserving it anymore. You can put salt as much as you want. Don't put too much salt, it's not healthy. What? We thought you were talking about a pickle that comes in jars. It's already pickled. Unless you want to make your own European pickle, right? By taking the cucumbers, that you can't do on Shabbat. Once you remove the peel, is actually not such a big problem. Because the pickling of pickles is in its complete form when it's a pickle that has a peel on it. So a lot of vegetables, once they're peeled, it's not a problem. But it all depends, if that vegetable is preserved or not. Tomatoes are not, again. Another time where this comes in handy, where it's important to keep this in mind, that the problems of me'abed, is in the preparation of mei mela. When do you prepare salt water? Obviously, if you forgot, you can do it, but you have to keep in mind that preparing the brine, preparing this mixture, is also just as asur as applying it to food. So therefore, if you're going to prepare salt water, just be careful to prepare less than 2 parts salt to 1 part water. Once you have 2 parts salt, 1 part water, it's very, very salty. That's already too much. So the mei melach, the salt water, even though you don't have the vegetable inside of it, it's also asur to prepare the bot. This whole formula that can be used to preserve food. So if you need to do it like on Yom Tov for Pesach, don't make it as salty. That's all. None of it. All right? Now we get into the more difficult area, the area of memahek. Now you may have heard something called memareach. Memahek is the av melacha, the main category of melacha that is prohibited on Shabbat. Memareach is a tolada. Tolada are all those melachot that are descendants. They resemble the av melacha and they're just as asur, midoraita. But they have a slightly different name. Now, what's memahek? In the Mishkan, memahek was the next step, and it was actually part of the me'abed too. It happened almost at the same time. You used to scrape off the hair, you used to rub the skin to smoothen it. Memahek is basically to smoothen, to rub, to flatten, to make a shape, to prepare the hides, so they should be manageable. That's what memahek was. And that's asur. And there are quite a few applications of memahek or of memareach. Before we go on, the basic difference between memahek and memareach is memahek applies to more solid products, hard solids, and memareach, you will find this definition of memareach in softer, more pliable products. that's what you need to keep in mind to understand the difference between the two. Is memahek usually applies to hard surfaces, and memareach applies to softer, not to very soft, but to softer surfaces. The idea of memareach or memahek is to soften, I wrote here in Hebrew, a rough surface. That rough surface can be either wood, furniture, or even the rust on metal. If you rub off the rust of metal, then you're basically cleaning it, the shifshu. It's a form of rubbing and preparing it and cleaning it that may fall under this category of memarech, so that should not be done on Shabbat. And this applies to any material. It applies to wood, furniture, it's a little rust, and you want to take sandpaper and do this, that would be memahek. Typical example. So we're not dealing with heights, right? We don't have a tannery in our backyard, right? But we can have quite a few applications of memahek. And I just gave you a few examples because it applies to quite a few things. It does not only apply to height. You know that in Europe, in the past, most of the streets were not paved. There were no sidewalks. And when it became rainy and snowy, it became very muddy too. So there was, in certain parts of Europe, right before you entered your house, at the edge of the street, a little piece of metal or wood, somewhat sharp, where people, before they entered their home, they would rub the soles of their shoes to remove that mud off the sulyot, off the sole. That's a surah. Because if the sulyah, if the sole of the shoe is made out of leather, that additional rubbing can be. It depends how hard you rub, obviously. It can, right? But it may be. You just may be committing memahek, rubbing off. Now, what we do today is if we have a little bit of mud, is we go to the sidewalk. The sidewalk is cement. It's a men's step, not sharp metal, and not using a knife. Right? We don't remove it with a knife. We go somewhere, whether it's on the heel or anywhere else, right? And we remove it at the sidewalk. That's fine. That's permissible. But one has to be careful with using a sharp object, especially a knife, and scraping it off. If the mud is already hard, it could be also tochen. Tochen is to grind. So that would also be a form of memahek, because if it's made out of leather, the sole of the shoe, you may be scraping it more and more and more, which would be a form of mehabed. It would be a surah. Yeah, but that would not be a problem under memahek. No, because water would not soften. Only oils would soften. Yeah, but you just have to be careful with clothing, with washing them. You can't bleach them. You can't whiten them. That's called libun. No, so when you have clothes, you have to be careful that if it's porous, right, depending on the garment, if it's porous, where you're extracting the dirt out of it, right, it's not a clean surface. And that would be washing it, right, which is a different melacha. And you can't wash clothing on Shabbat. You can't remove the stains. All right, another example is which would be under memareach, much more than memachek, is using putty or caulking on Shabbat. You can, if you have, let's say, you have putty around the window pane, and you want to straighten it out or apply it. That's a sunnah on Shabbat. That would be under memareach. So you cannot put putty or even straighten out the putty on Shabbat. The same thing with caulking. You know what caulking is, right? To fill in the holes and cracks, right? You would not be able to smear the caulking in those cracks. That would also be memareach. Now, some say that if wax falls on a siddur, on a sefer Torah, one has to be careful how you remove it. The best way to remove it is by not touching it, of course, folding it and letting it fall by itself, or using a knife. And you have to be careful. If you use a knife, make sure that this wax is not non-kosher wax. Right? Because there are, in the old days especially, they used to make non-kosher wax. If you're going to remove it with a knife, make sure that it's okay, the wax is okay. So the knife would be the best way, or do not touch it, because by touching the wax, sometimes one may come to the mareach as well, to smearing it, or deforming the shape. Because any deformation of the shape, for example with soft wax, especially with soft wax, is a form of a mareach. So if you have soft wax, you cannot make shapes with it. That would also be called a mareach. Okay, now we come to also either under the mareach or the mahek. Candlelight time. If we use candles and not oil, how do we use the candles? We glue the candle to the candle holder, right? So it shouldn't fall on Shabbat. Let's say it's loosened up. You cannot glue the candle on Shabbat or on Yom Tov either to the candle holder. So you can't take the candle, put it next to a flame, and let the bottom melt a little bit so you can glue it to the bottom, to the holder. That hamatat, that melting of the ner shava, of the candle, of the wax candle, is a form of memareach. Because what is memareach? Remember, memareach is with softer items, that rubbing it or deforming it or shaping it resembles the melacha of memachek. So whether it's a hard surface or whether it's a soft surface, it's either going to come under memachek or memareach. Another example of memareach is using chapsticks on Shabbat. Right? It's a more or less a hard surface, and when you are rubbing it against the lips, it's a form of memachet. The same is true with lipstick. But with lipstick, as we explained in the past, there's also the additional problem of sovea, of coloring, depending on the lipstick you use. So when women use lipsticks on Shabbat, they may be transgressing two melachot, sovea and memareach. So you have to be careful with the lipstick. Same thing with the hard shoe polish. The hard shoe polish is a form of memareach, and that would be asur. Another example is the hard stick deodorant. You use hard stick deodorant, you can't use it on Shabbat, but you can use the roll-on. You know what I mean by the roll-on? The liquid? That's okay. The spray is okay. You cannot use the hard stick, because what are you doing? You are removing the shufshuf. You're rubbing off the surface and deforming it or reshaping it, and that is a form of the mahek or the This I don't think most of you will come across in had zefet, to take tar. I don't think anybody would want to do that on Shabbat, but that would be also asur. And the same thing with forming items out of clay. You're taking the clay and you're forming it. Now here there may be additional problems. There may be makeh patish, there may be boneh. You're building something, you're forming something, you're completing something. But there can also be, in managing, in working with the clay, that can also be the mareah. And finally, we also have miruach shuman adeh. If it's a very thick fat that has congealed and you want to smear it somewhere, that may be a problem. These are all perhaps problematic mideoraita, according to the Torah. However, there are two additional categories in the mareach. One is completely permissible, and one is asur at least midrabanan, and that is the one that we have to pay close attention to, because even though it's not asur midrabanan, it's still asur, because it resembles the av melacha. And we actually deal with this quite often. And that is anything which is not completely solid, it's a little bit soft, and it retains its density. In other words, you cannot pour it as a liquid. When you're pouring it or, spilling it on something, it retains its density. It does not scatter completely. It retains its shape and form, and it stays together. You know what I mean? Pretty much like honey. That would be just a quick example. Now, not that that's going to be the example, but that's the idea of something which is half solid, half liquid. It's not completely liquidy, right? Like yogurt, right? And it's not completely solid. So if it's a half solid, midrabanan is asur. The most common examples of the isur midrabanan and mareach are creams and ointments. So if you ever wondered why in Shabbat we did not put cream, I didn't say any cream. You see, hand lotions may be okay, but the thicker creams or the ointments, especially the medical ones that you squeeze from a bottle, that you cannot apply on Shabbat. There is a way, however, to do it. The baby has a rash. I'm going to show you how to do it. Okay? Yeah. I'm going to get to that. Okay? So it all depends. The thicker ones, the thick ointments, the creams, and even some of the eyeshadows that are creamy. All of this would be prohibited, at least with the Rabbanan, because it's soft and it resembles the mareach. There's a question, however, on toothpaste. Toothpaste also, the density, the consistency is very similar to these mishot, to these ointments. So what do you say about toothpaste? The custom today in the world, in all communities, is not to use toothpaste on Shabbat, unless you have to. For some reason, you're in extreme pain and discomfort, and you're used to using it every single day, and you can't go without it, and there is no mouthwash. You can use it on condition, and here comes another important point that people forget. Even though it may be permissible according to some opinions, you have to be careful that when you rub your teeth with a toothbrush, that no blood comes out. So if you know yourself that no blood is going to come out when you rub your gums, your teeth, and you have to have this toothpaste, there are some opinions that permit it. The custom is not to use toothpaste on Shabbat. So I told you what the custom is. Everywhere. That's what's acceptable. That's the norm. But if there is a need, there are some who permit it, as long as you're careful with the toothbrush, that you don't take out any blood from that. The same thing with all those creams or ointments that are very, very liquidy. The way you can tell if something is very liquidy is if it absorbs itself into the skin. So a lot of the hand lotions, let's say you have dry hands and you just want to apply some hand lotion, it's mutar. It's permissible because it's not a thick ointment. It's not a thick cream that will remain on top and look the same way as when you squeeze it out of the bottle. Once you put it, it absorbs itself into the skin. You don't even see it on the surface anymore. Any hand lotion like that absorbs itself into the skin is not thick. It's permissible on Shabbat, no problem whatsoever. Alright, another point that brings us back to the creams and ointments. Sometimes you need to put an ointment. As you know, Shabbat midrabanan is asur to apply certain types of medication, but in some cases it's permissible. A child, a baby has a rash, in the diapers, and you want to put something for the rash. You can squeeze the ointment onto the area, the surface, as long as you don't smear it. So if there is a rash, it's permissible lishchot. There's no isur to just apply, to just put the cream on a particular spot. The real problem is the smearing, right? That's the problem. The rabbis, however, said can't put it just anywhere because you may come to smear. But the real issue is the smearing. So if you need to, for example, with the rash of a baby, you need to apply some ointment, the best way is to just put it and then close the diaper and whatever happens, happens. As long as you don't smear it, it's okay. But if you need to do it, that's the way to do it. Just put it there, squeeze it there, right? And not touch it anymore, not smear it. That's all. It's perfectly okay. Yeah, there's no problem with squeezing it. The real problem is the smearing it. No, for the face it would not be permissible if it's one of those thicker creams. So only those hand lotions that are very, very thin, that are absorbed. Yeah, right. Something that is very, very liquidy. Something that will not remain on the surface. It will be absorbed, it's okay. I'm just saying, yeah.
Why do you put water on bread?
I'm getting there. The last point in the mareach is that en mareach be'ochlim. This does not apply to food. This isur of smearing, or the machek and mareach, however you look at it, does not apply to food. So if you want to smear some peanut butter on your sandwich, or butter, or whatever it might be, perfectly okay, no problem. Because this does not apply for food. It doesn't look like the real thing. Nobody will come to confuse it with the real thing. It makes no difference. Right? The only time that you don't want to do this, and we'll talk about that next week, writing and erasing. But now we're talking about smearing. So the smearing, if it's just for decoration, should not be done. But if it's for the food, it's perfectly okay. Okay, the last two melachot are very short, and also had to do a little bit with the hides. After we were done processing them, there was mesartet. Mesartet is making the lines. Have you ever seen a Sefer Torah, the lines that are made in order to be able to write straight, or in order to be able to cut straight? So the whole idea of sirtut in the time of the Mishkan was to enable us to cut straight. And after we've cut them, we wanted to sew them or put them together or whatever. So that is mesartet. The mesartet itself was the melacha that involved making the lines, drawing the lines. Now, drawing does not necessarily mean that you're using a pen. Anything that makes a sharp indentation, a siman of sorts, on the cloth, on the hide, it would be mesartet. So this melacha of sirtut applies to all sorts of material. Even though we're talking about hides and skins, mesartet can apply, and we'll see maybe one or two examples, to other types of materials. For example, let's say you want to cut wood. You want to cut it exactly in a particular spot. You make a sirtut, that would be called mesartet. Because your whole intention, what is the intention here? Is to cut straight. Where else is this very applicable? Toilet paper. If you had no cut toilet paper, and remember we spoke about this and you had to use toilet paper, there was no other way around it. You could just tear pieces as long as you were careful not to tear or to cut where it's perforated, at the perforation. Right? I'm sorry. That I got mixed up. That's really the next melacha of mechatech. The two go together, but let's leave that for later. Mesartet was actually the making of the line. The cutting at the perforation is mechatech. So I'm going to leave that example for later. This mesartet does not apply to food. You can cut cake however you want. You can make the siman on the challah, as the customary is. There's no sirtut ve'ochel. However, what you should be careful is not to fold a page or paper, right, exactly in half, so that after Shabbat, you're going to cut it exactly on that line, right? Because that would be also a form of sirtut. Some are even mahmir. There's an opinion that is even mahmir for a different reason, not to fold the page, at the corner, so you should remember where it is. It's not asur, but there are some who are mahmir, who are strict in that, for a different reason, not to make that a siman. But otherwise, there's no real isur, because you don't plan to cut it. The whole idea of sirtut is because your intention is to cut. So you go ahead and draw a line exactly where you want to cut. That's the regular type of sirtut. But what we need to remember is that it applies to all materials. So however you do it, however you accomplish it, if you make siman, it would be asur, it would come under the melacha of mesartet. But it does not apply to food. Okay, the last one is mechatech. When I said toilet paper, I meant this one because mechatech means cutting exactly according to a particular measure. I want exactly this size. So after we've had the sirtut, we've had the lines, now I want to cut it exactly this size. As opposed to what? As opposed to korea, that I don't distinguish. I'm not concerned on the size. I'm going to cut a piece. So with toilet paper, if you are careful to cut at the perforation, that may be a form of mechatech, because you want it exactly that size. It's important for you that it be that size. You want to cut it there. So if you have to, you can just tear it, but be careful not to tear it at the perforation. This also, just like mechatech applies to everything. to all materials, not just to hide. It applies to paper as well. It does not apply to ochel. You can cut food whatever size you want. You can draw the lines as we said before. But it does not apply to food. Towel paper you don't really need, because a towel would be happy to dry up the surface. You don't want to, with the toilet paper they permit it because of the need, of the real need, kaboda briot, the people who have nothing, they need to clean themselves somehow, for no reason, unless there's a certain need, right, and especially for food it's permissible. So tearing or removing the plastic hagura, on milk and on certain bottles there's like a ring. So those plastics rings around the milk bottles, around certain types of bottles that are put there for seal of protection, right? It has a line exactly, so when you're opening it exactly on that line, it's not a problem. It's mutar. Not a problem. You can do it. You can open it. Why? Not just because it's food. It's important to keep in mind with the chatech that, eventually we'll discuss this. Melechet machshevet asar Torah. On Shabbat there's something called melechet machshevet. What is your intention? What are you trying to accomplish? The company, when they put that thing, it was just intended for protection, right? Does not in any way make it any easier for you if you open it there or not. That's all it's there for. You're just removing that extra wrapper, that extra seal. That's all it's there for. As opposed to what? This may surprise you. As opposed to a tissue box. A tissue box where you have a perforation, you want to have it that size. The perforation is not there only to make it easy for you to open, right? The perforation is there because you want it to be that size. Now let's go to another example. With bags, potato chips, and food items, the perforation is only there for what reason? To make it easier for you to open it. It's hard sometimes to tear it. So they put your perforation for what? So just for the ease. It's not that you want it in that sense. So you are allowed to open potato chip bags, any bag that contains food, at its perforation, there's no problem. Same thing with those rings, the plastic rings, you can remove it. No problem. Because all it is for ease, or because it's a still protection. It has nothing to do with, that's the measure, that's the midah that you want. Whereas with the tissue box, or with the toilet paper, you want it that size. And what's mechatech? Mechatech is not just cutting, that's more similar to korea. As we will see, mechatech is quite different, and not only does it apply to everything, it has to be for a certain measure, right? That's basically Allah towards the end. Even though they appear to resemble mechatech and korea, there's two important differences. I think these are the basic differences between the two. Remember when we spoke about korea, I gave the example of thread. There's no korea in thread. If you have a piece of thread and you tore it, there's no korea. Why? Because you don't tie them back together. Korea was tied somehow to tofer. And if you want to put the thread together, it's cut, you tie it. You don't sew two pieces of the thread together. They are related. One, in a way, depends on the other. So Korea does not apply to threads. Here it would apply. Mechatech, because mechatech, what are you saying? I want this size of a thread. I want it 3 inches long, 4 inches long. And you cut it just at that size, that would be mechatech. It would be asur because of mechatech, not because of Korea. Another difference between Korea and mechatech, if you remember, Korea does not apply to a piece of wood, 2x4. Let's say you cut it somehow, right? You didn't do any Korea. Korea does not apply to hard surfaces, it applies only to soft surfaces. Mechatech applies to everything. So if you cut a piece of wood, a piece of glass, with a certain measurement, regardless of what the surface is, it will be mechatech. So that's where the two would be somewhat different. Even though they appear to be the same, they resemble each other, but they're different. Yeah. You can't open a tissue box on Shabbat. Well, obviously, if you need it, you would tear it. You wouldn't open it by the perforation. So it's the same like a toilet paper. Let's say you had no toilet paper. All you had was tissue paper, and you have a sealed box. So the same heter that applies to toilet paper would apply to tissue paper, but you would have to be careful not to open it by the perforation, that's all. Some other way from the bottom, take it out, by being mekalkel, by destroying the box. That will be okay. Alright, and just like mesartet, mechatech does not apply to any food. As we said before, you can cut anything, any size, any measure that you want. It doesn't apply to food. No. Because anything you do it partially is not permissible. Just to tear for no reason. It makes no difference how much you tear. And if it's a little bit open, you can anyway take out what there's for sure no need. The real problem is when you're stuck. What do you do now? Okay, so we covered 4 melachot today. Nafshit, me'abed, me'machek. Actually, we covered 5. Mesartet and me'machek. We covered 5 melachot, Baruch Hashem. Yeah. Some of them were very brief melachot. But nevertheless, from time to time, you'd be surprised that there are certain applications that you have to be aware of, especially in the area of Memahekin and Mareach. Right? One has to remember what he's allowed to put on. He uses the odorants, which one he can use, because they are at least assumed in the Rabbanan. So even though we're not working with hide, there's quite a few applications other than hides. Because some of these melachot apply to any type of surface. It doesn't only have to be with a hide. Like we saw with the tooth, with drawing the lines. It could be on any surface, as long as your intention is to cut. When you're folding a piece of an article from the newspaper, using your nail, for example, to cut it exactly at the dots, you shouldn't be reading the newspaper to begin with on Shabbat, right? So if you see the scoop on it, you can't make the siman with your nail. Regardless of what you use, whether you use a keli, a tool, or whether you use a pen, that will be a form of simtut, that will be a surah on Shabbat. Those things to remember to keep in mind. Okay, B'ezrat Hashem, next week we'll be doing, I believe, kotel and mohek, not to be confused with memahek. Memahek was more closely resembling smearing, right? Perhaps one item that I left out that I should mention now with memahek is hard soap. I don't think we mentioned hard soap because we mentioned just the odor there. With hard soap, the custom is in the world. Remember with toothpaste, the custom? The same is true with hard soap. The custom is not to use hard soap on Shabbat because it may be a form of memahek, but you can use liquid soap. Right? So that's the custom. There are opinions that say it's completely permissible with powdered soap. What is that? The liquid soap. Powder, I've never seen. It all depends on its consistency. Right. Yeah, but that's very, very soft. So, it wouldn't have the same problem as the hard. That would be a different problem. We call it paste, right? Like if you spoke about doing Lisha. So there might be other problems involved when you're doing these things. But as far as the mahek and soap, the custom is not to use hard soap, but to use liquid soap. And even with liquid soap, which is a very, very thick liquid soap, some people dilute it with additional water. So it should be very liquid. As I said before, with the mareach, if it's something which is easily dissolved and absorbed in the skin, there's no problem. Anytime that it's a little thick, like creams and ointments, and it stays there, you don't want to spread it. That's what's acceptable in the world. The Jewish people in the world have accepted this. It's brought down in the Mishnah Berurah. Mishnah Berurah is a major opinion to reckon with. That we don't use hard soap on Shabbat. It doesn't mean that it's a sur necessarily, because there are leniencies, there are opinions that permit it. But like I said with toothpaste or ragya is mahir if you have no choice. If you really need it, there's nothing else, and you are desperate. But even he says, that anybody that does not have a real need, he has mouthwash, for example, should not use it. And even if you do use it for whatever reason, you have to be careful with toothbrush. If that toothbrush is going to cause blood to come out, then you shouldn't use it. Then use your finger, and not the toothbrush. So there are certain things that we have accepted upon ourselves that we're extra careful because they resemble, or they may be the actual melachah. So if you can hold off one day, it's no big deal. Right, there are two separate issues here. The toothbrush is the blood. You don't want to take out blood from the skin, from the gums. And it's the toothpaste itself, which because of its consistency, may be a form of mareach. So because of that, we do not use it for Shabbat. We use other things, mouthwash. But if you're desperate and you use it every day and you can't do without it, there are some opinions that allow it. But that I mentioned what the custom is with hard soap. Okay, there's no more questions. We'll see you next week. Next week we still have one more Wednesday before Sukkot. There won't be a shiur. But next week, we'll cover a few more melachot, and hopefully maybe by November we'll be able to start. We're almost done.